we have our last but not least speaker of today. Hi, Vitaly. How are you doing?
Good to see you. Look at you. You are very passive today.
And do you hear the jingling? It's amazing.
Well, I'm not going to pretend that I love this, so this is okay. It is great, though.
I got this from a friend of mine last year for a physical event that we did last year, back in the days before everything went
I
bananas.
remember.
You do remember? That's wasn't it like a year ago today that you did a workshop with us in Zurich?
I think it was very close for sure. So I think that this was also the meetup, and I was really so excited about this. And it was a long one. It was the end of the very long year, and so we ended up. It was like with a very nice kind of get together. Final day.
I miss you. I miss you.
Oh, same here.
I hope that we get to see each other and hug each other soon.
Oh, you know what? I actually made a kind of a deal with this year. So yes, so this year I just said goodbye to this year, and we agreed, both of us, that the next year is going to be the best year ever for everybody, including the wonderful people who are listening right now, and of course you, and probably your hat as well.
My hat will have a fantastic day, and then
I have no doubt about that.
My hat is basically done for the year, and then also looking forward to a better 2021, where he hopefully, or she, I don't know, I don't want to assume anything, where it will finally get to meet more people. Waiting for that for a long time. Yes. And I know that you have been coming to us from another event, so I hope that all went well, and that you are. Look at that! That is amazing.
It's just,
would you mind sharing?
It's very interesting because, like, in general, if you speak about like online events and all, it's nice to have them, but it's still very different from what you get in an in-person conference, of course. But on the other side, you can actually be in like 4 or 5 different places at the same day, which is not something you could pull off, in the good old days. But I think that the future, we can talk about it a bit later, maybe, will be very, very interesting for online events and offline events and all. So we'll see.
Oh yeah, we learned a lot about online events this year. The good, the bad, the ugly, basically. I think I should probably at some point talk about that or write a blog post about that, maybe.
That would be useful.
Yeah, maybe I should do that. I should share my insights there. And yours, because I'm pretty sure you have been doing like a bazillion online events, don't know?
Not bazillion, but we did a few, and we did learn some things along the way. I actually published an article about this just, I think, a month ago or 2 months ago, basically focused on online workshops. That was really exciting because you end up reaching people that you would never reach otherwise as well.
Yeah,
so that
for workshops is awesome.
Yeah, so
I'm going to read that one. But before I get to read that one, would you like to take us into a completely new world of wonder like you always do and share your slides with us?
Yes, I will do my best. So
excellent.
I believe there is a share screen button, and when I look at the share screen button, it seems like I can share the screen. So I'm going to do that, and then we have the inception thing.
That's amazing. Look at that. Ooh,
that's incredible. But now, if I go and actually make it full screen here, do you please let me know if you can actually see the cat?
We can see the cat, I think.
Just
YouTube, can you see the cat? YouTube, give us a shout.
Well, there's usually like 20 seconds delay between.
It's awkward delay. I should really not do these like live interactions with YouTube where there is like a safety delay. But in the chat, Alexei said that it is indeed a year ago that you were in Zurich and we were actually seeing each other in person.
This was actually a year ago, and it was a very important year for me in many ways. And so I was really looking forward to the next one, very much like today. Repeating the good old days.
Same old, right?
Yeah, but the talk is different. So this talk today is going to be different.
Yes, I'm really looking. Last year was privacy, and now we're getting web forms right, and that's cool. I'm looking forward to that. And as YouTube told me that they can see the cat, I shall shut my mouth close and give the stage to you. Have fun. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hey, thank you so much, Martin. Hello, everyone. Such a pleasure to be there, although albeit, digitally. Yes, it was a year ago when we actually met. Maybe I hope at least that I met some of you. And this was an interesting year for all of us, I think, in many ways. For one reason for me as well, just because actually, if I'm being very honest, I also had a bit of time to think and to make some decisions and to look into the things that are happening on the web, and also specifically kind of try to develop myself, I guess, when you had the time. So one of the things that was really interesting for me was actually to figure out how to deal with forms. And it was a really strange situation, because most of the time when we think about forms, we might think about things like checkout and things like that, which are kind of done. So you look at Shopify and you look at Magento, you look at this traditional checkout, and you might be right to assume that within the last 20-25 years of existence of the web and of e-commerce, we should be in the position where we have got it. We know what we're doing. And I was very, very fascinated to see that this is not the case at all. So what I want to do with you today is to kind of look into what is the deal with forms, how we can make forms a bit better, and what could be done strategically to avoid issues down the line. And again, when I talk about web forms, of course, we're going to need to look into a very general, broad definition of web forms, because they're not just checkout or anything, and they're not coming out of nowhere. Obviously, forms have a past, and this is where essentially they're coming from. Many of the interfaces that we are going to be designing today will be mimicking in one way or the other something that we're used to from paper forms. And if you look at the paper forms, like the State of California voter registration form, you'll find out like all the fine little things, like a US citizen, yes or no. Maybe it's checkboxes. Maybe it's radio buttons, it's hard to say. That's going to be a select drop-down for sure, right? And then you have the different width fields with different widths, sometimes long ones, sometimes short ones, sometimes last name, middle name, first name. Many ways, exactly the same thing that we're actually mimicking in web interfaces as well. And then you also have address, and then if you know street address, describe where you live, right? So it's like address line 2, if you like. And then, of course, again, the state, the zip code, and other things. As you keep going, eventually you're discovering this big one, which is the biggest button I've ever seen, plus a couple of multi-select options, I guess, over here as well. And the truth is, of course, that forms are actually everywhere. It doesn't matter what you do, it doesn't matter where you're looking and what you're designing, what you're building, you will have to deal with some sort of forms. Because why? Well, because forms is a very common interface element which requires some interaction. So if you have a sign up or checkout form, if you have search or filtering form, newsletters, configurators, online transactions, any kind of services, application forms, authentication, really doesn't really matter. You will have to deal with forms. Now, unfortunately, most of the times, these forms don't look very cool, right? So this is, a bit boring. Maybe you have your billing address and you have, those things, and sometimes they're a little bit shorter. But what really surprised me, and I just questioned myself and my life choices at some point, because I'm really passionate about forms. I don't know about you, but I love a good button or a good radio button, or even at times a nice little autocomplete, even if it's a drop-down. I do, but I still don't get some of the decisions that we've been making for the last years or decades. Specifically, it is very common still to ask for an email address and then to ask to verify your email address. And what we usually do is, of course, copy pasting unless we're being blocked from that. Now, we always do the same for the password as well. It's not uncommon to ask for a password and then to verify the password yet again, right? But why don't we ever do that for first name and last name? Why is nobody ever asked me to verify my first name or verify my last name? They're probably a bit more important than the password or the email that we're setting, right? Well, and then, of course, there is a question of, optional or required. How do we mark optional? How do we mark required? Seems obvious, but these are some of the decisions we need to make, right? And we'll get to that in the course of this talk as well. Now, sometimes forms are just weird. Like this is one of the stranger ones. If you ever wanted to apply for a visa to go to the UK back in the day, you would got kind of to the page where you were asked to fill in your data. And that page was titled Other Passport. It's very convenient, very friendly, I guess. And then the note here was saying, enter all characters exactly as they appear on your ID, including letters, numbers, and bracket symbols, which you are supposed to type in. And in fact, if you have a passport that actually has those brackets in, you actually have to type them in here, otherwise the form wouldn't validate, right? It's just a little bit weird and a little bit strange, right? And then it gets madder and this gets crazier, because this is probably the weirdest thing I've seen in my life. So please write down the timestamp of the time right now, because you will never see something like that ever again. So if you are interested in signing up for a newsletter on an e-commerce site, what you're supposed to do on that particular site is to add the newsletter sign up to the shopping cart. You can also change the quantity of it, right? Now, luckily it's free and you can also remove it. So then you're supposed to check out with that thing. You check out, and as you check out, you're typing in your first name, your last name, your middle name, your email address, your password, and all of that. And then by email, you're receiving a notification about the newsletter sign-up link, which you need to click in order to go to the newsletter sign-up page, where you can actually type in your email yet again manually. And then, and that's the best part, you actually get an email to verify your email, right? Why do we do this? Right? And it sounds like, okay, some of the weird experiences and weird interfaces from the dark side of the web or so. But in reality, it's kind of all over. That example I show all the time. This is an insurance company from Germany, and in here, in the form, they are asking a very simple question: do you have children? And the proper interface solution for answering this kind of question, because in the end, the forms are all about asking questions and getting the right answers, right? It's all about, just dragging a value on a slider with the value count plus pencil icon that you can click on, right? And you might ask yourself why, but what I ask myself is, how is it going to work specifically? Because if you have a slider, sliders have this kind of natural thing, which they have a minimum value and a maximum value. Now, luckily, the minimum value is 0, which is something that we probably know. But then whenever you go to the maximum here, what are you going to set? What is it going to be? Now, luckily, it's 10, right? But if you happen to have 11, you can have a way out, because you can click on the pencil icon, and then this thing turns into an input field, which you can type in 11 into, but then the interface will tell you, no, 10. It's at most 10, right? And so this thing is just all over. Now, of course, not all interfaces are like that. Some of them are just a bit confusing. I guess you could tell what kind of interface that is, right? So if we look into it in action, this is what it's going to be like, right? This is a page where you are supposed to filter some of the products available in the catalog by size. And specifically, this is the one that's coming in on a sales page, right? And I'm wondering, yes, I do like buttons. I have nothing against buttons. Is there a better way of designing this? And I started really thinking about, is there really a better way of designing this? And what would it be? Right? Not to make fun of all those examples, but just how can I figure out if a solution that I'm coming up with for a form is better or not? Is something like this, for example, which would go from 0 to 100 or so, better? How can I say if it's better or not, right? And this will kind of becomes quickly the first part that I want kind of to dive into, really get a very objective measures. Because if you ask you, right, this is a good design, this is a bad design, that's very subjective. It's like you can't really do anything with it. I need to get some metrics to figure out if something is bad or not. Now, I know that this is bad, for example. Why? Well, because it takes a remarkable amount of time and it's extremely annoying and painful to type in. And I'm not even talking about the audio version of the captcha, right, which is just frustrating. And frustration is never good to anybody. It's definitely not good for business, and it's definitely not going to be good for any customer, right? Now, luckily, we got rid of the captcha with reCAPTCHA, with invisible captcha or reCAPTCHA free, right? So we ended up with another version of the captcha, which of course is the world of crosswalks and traffic lights, where I'm always wondering, this particular pixel, that pixel, this one pixel over here on the crossing between two rectangles, is it actually still the crosswalk, or is it not, right? And so we end up with all of these experiences, and I really want to just figure out what would make a good design and what would make a bad design. Now, just before this entire madness this year started, I was lucky to be teaching in the University of the Netherlands in Amsterdam. And I was talking to students, just trying to understand how do they see the web. And it was not specifically focused on forms, but I just wanted to kind of get a feeling, because, I'm 35 right now, and students were between 18 and 23, and there is a generation between us. And I was really kind of trying to understand how do they see the web. And I was very frustrated, by the frustrations that they had when experiencing the web. They don't even like the web the way I did when I was 22, 23, 24. And what do they don't like about the web? Well, they don't like small panes. Like, remember, whenever you have an e-commerce site and you have those filters for branding, and they might have like hundreds of options in there, you have a very, very tiny window where you have to scroll very carefully to get to the right one and hit the right checkbox. It's very frustrating, very annoying. The same goes for tiny click targets. Right? For example, a newsletter checkbox that you always find in the form, right? Whenever you want to opt out from being spammed, unexpected content shifts where things move around, images coming in, layout change, and things like that. Unexpected page reloads, which also happen very often in forms where you click submit, for example, to apply a coupon code, and all of a sudden the entire page gets kind of refreshed, right, or reloaded, and you just try to figure out what actually has happened, right? The country selector dropdown, and Netherlands is really not in a bad place, not in a good place here, because if you look in a regular country selector dropdown, where you might have all 292 countries, I think maybe 293 at this point. Well, where do you look for Netherlands? For Netherlands, is it going to be in the top, prioritized because it's one of the fancier countries, or is it going to be not prioritized and be somewhere in the middle, starting with an N because it's Netherlands? Will it be the Netherlands? Will it be in Dutch, or will it be in German, or will it be in Cyrillic, or will it be in any other language, right? This is always a story, and it's actually much faster to just type in. The other thing is generic error messages that don't really help at all, right? Which are just frustrating. If you tell somebody that there is an error just by having a red border around it, it doesn't really help because you don't know how to fix the error. Or input that's fully cleared on error, right? That's even worse. Buttons that are disabled, be it next button or be it back button, right? Because people move across, back and forth quite a bit. Disabled copy paste, nobody likes that. Sliders, imagine you need to change the slider, for example, for pricing, just a little bit, push one edge to the left or one edge to the right. And it's always so hard. And instead, it would be much more reasonable to have an input field, which we usually don't have. Plus, draconian password requirements. Some people do use password managers, some people do not. And if you do not use a password manager, especially for something like creating an account in an e-commerce site, you will be reusing the same password over and over again, unless the owner of the site will ask you to come up with a more complex password, which you will do by adding some characters that you don't have yet, these cryptic characters, to your baseline password, just appending them to the end, just to pass the gates, and then forgetting that password the moment you will be checking out, right? Anytime you have to retype complex input, which is forms, for example, for credit card input, because of PCI compliance, those things get cleared when you're moving from the review page to the address page and then back, right? That's my favorite one. Birthday picker that starts in 2020, right? Well, if you are typing in your birthday picker, your birthday, that's probably 2020 is probably not the right year to start. Well, what would it be? We'll talk about it in a moment. And then things like scroll checking, parallax, and of course the captcha thing, identifying buses and crosswalks. Right? These are the things that people don't like, and it's not surprising. But really surprising, though, to me, is that all of those things, in some way or the other, are related to one single thing, and that would be forms, right? And so we have to get them right. And this is exactly what I kind of want to look into in a bit more detail today. So when we look into forms, I think one of the important things to understand first is how do people perceive forms, or specifically, how do people perceive input in web forms, right? Because when we look into it, it seems very obvious that you would ask for the first name, you would ask for the last name, and then just proceed this way. But let's just take a very close look at some of those decisions that we're making when we're designing those interfaces. One of them would be a date picker. Is it a good date picker? Is it a bad date picker? Right? Can you tell? It's probably very hard to say. Like, how can you tell? Many of us, I think, will say, no, this is not a good one. There's a lot of cognitive overload. It's just a lot of options. It's a lot of stuff repeated. Probably not very useful at all. Just checking if everything's looking fine. Yes, everything's looking fine here. So, that's probably not a good one. Okay, so what about this one? Is this a good one? I'm just going to play it for a moment. This is the one where you have to type in the birth date, right? I can guess what is wrong here, right? And no, it's not like the previous one, right, where you have a select drop-down. You actually have an input field. The problem is it's not keyboard focusable, right? So you can't really just type in the numbers. Instead, you have to use, you actually have to use the widget in order to type it in. And then you have multiple levels, right? So for years and also for months. So probably an obvious way of measuring if it's good design or not would be the time. How much time, how many taps, how many clicks would be required to actually fill it in completely. And I guess that any kind of manual input for this complex input, right, would probably be faster than any select dropdown or any kind of widget like this. Or at least you need to support both, right, the keyboard input and the date picker as well. So when you start talking to people, you realize that very often the way people think about things is not necessarily mimicking what we create in interfaces. For example, when you ask somebody for their name, right? They never break down the name into parts, saying my first name is this, my middle name is that, and my last name is that. And sometimes people call me Joey, right? Well, people say, my name is this, and sometimes people call me Joey, right? There is no structure that's naturally involved in the way we speak. However, we actually mimic this structure mostly because of the databases that are happening, kind of sitting in the back in our front end, right? And that's kind of an issue because in many ways we're replicating a lot of legacy that's coming up from the way postal services work, for example, where they need a particular field for particular areas and for particular pieces of information, right? So we maybe need to revisit that. The same goes for address, right? This is why we have address line 1 and we have address line 2, right? Because we have this legacy systems, especially like if you think about UPS or the American US Postal Service, where they have very old legacy systems where they actually have to type in manually street, building number, apartment, unit, building, floor, PO box, and so on and so forth, right? And the same goes for many, many other things as well, right? So I was really trying to figure out like how can we then better map what people think with what we design. And that requires us, first of all, to break out of things that we used to see. So many of you it would probably take a while for many of you, definitely took a while for me to understand how this one works, right? Now, this is a date picker, just not a regular one. Is it a good design? Is it a bad design? How can you tell? Well, it's a brilliant design, right? It's essentially a constructor of a date, but it would be horrible for something like an airline website or any examples that I showed previously. Why? Well, because you actually would use it on a dashboard or on a tablet where people, and it was designed for the New York Public Library, when people would index books. And they would index books much faster on a tablet where you have big buttons that you can tap easily, right? Definitely way more effective than ls select dropdown, right, in that particular case. And definitely way more useful than I would say any kind of date picker that we're used to, right? So when I think about an effectiveness of something, I think about speed. And that means we need to think about how fast do people type, both on mobile and on tablet and on desktop. Now, so there's a lot of data in here, but there are just a few key things that I want you to take away from this. First of all, there is a difference of the speed with which we're typing, and it differs depending on what we are typing. So if you have to decipher a CAPTCHA, right, this is going to take you more time just because you really have to read every single character and try to get what it is, right? On the other hand, when it comes to an English word that you know, like learn or so, you'd be really, really fast in typing it. It's almost like a muscle memory. So on average, I did forget to add a source here, but I will. On average, you will have users typing in one character in English of an English word, if they are familiar with an English language, of course, in around 300 milliseconds. But if it's an obscure text that they don't know or a language they don't speak properly, it will take 750 milliseconds. Think about, having to type in something in a language you don't know, like maybe Swedish or so. It will take you a while to actually type it because you just don't know the language. Now, on the other hand, what's really quite important as well is that you will need a bit of time to switch between the keyboard and the mouse. And that might not sound like a big deal, so sure, like, yeah, you will be needing some time to switch between keyboard and mouse. But the more we enforce or require people to switch to mouse or to keyboard or back and forth, the slower the typing will be, right? Because it's always going to start slowly yet again. And then whenever you switch to, from keyboard to mouse, you will have to switch back as well. So you'll be losing almost a second on that. Seems like, sure, like makes sense. Well, we need to ask ourselves, do we require our customers in our important sign-up form to switch from keyboard to mouse a lot, right? Because when do people switch between the keyboard and mouse? Well, first of all, when they cannot use tab order properly. So if you don't have a proper tab order in your form, then people will have to fix it by using the mouse quite a bit and navigating through the form by using the mouse, right? And now, on the other hand, whenever you have any kind of interactive elements or something that's just far away from each other, like maybe a continue button that's all the way in the right upper corner as a floating button, right? Or maybe it's something like a select drop-down or anything that people are more likely to interact with the mouse, right? Then, well, you will have this switch quite a bit, right? So we have to consider this as well, which all means altogether, if you think about an 8 fields address form, right? With all the things that I showed previously, like the PO box, the address line 2 stuff, and so on, if you have appropriate order for tabbing and you let people stay on the keys, be it on mobile or on desktop, people will in general tab or fill in a form 3 times faster. And that's quite important. Now, also is important that if you do support autofill, autocomplete that browsers have, right, the completion time will be reduced by at least 30%. This is one of the statistics that came out from Google, I think, a year ago or so. It might be even better now because autocomplete got better as well, right? And that means that when I start thinking about, the speed, I think about two particular metrics, which I call the input budgets for forms. Because we know a few things. We know that typing on mobile is still very slow and still very inaccurate, right? We know that. We also know that changing input source, changing the keyboard, for example, on mobile is going to be quite expensive and take a bit of time. We also know that input flow is never linear. People tend to review things, they make mistakes, they go back, they have error messages and things like that. And we also know that touch input is always faster or better than text input, unless it's a lot of scrolling or a lot of clicking required. And that means that we can look into these very simple metrics, which are number 6 and 7 here. Let's measure how much time a person needs to fill in a form successfully. And that means if you take into account that somebody is typing correct input only, but they don't make any mistakes, no errors show up at all, what is the minimum number of taps that is required to fill in that form? Or what is the minimum number of clicks that is required to fill in the form? Or what is the minimum number of keystrokes that is required to fill in the form, right? Ideally, if you have your input and you have a proper tab order, that number will probably match very closely, right, the actual length of each string that you're supposed to type in, right? In that case, that's pretty reasonable. That's pretty good. But if it's not the case and you have to move around quite a bit, then it's probably bad. Now, on the other hand, there is also this notion of perceived complexity that we usually have, right? Which is how many input fields do we show at a given time, right? At most, do we show like 20? Do we show at most 5? Because the smaller the steps are, and of course they need to be logically grouped, but the smaller the steps are, the more likely people are to go through them faster. Now, with this in mind, it's also important to consider that there is always a very different but a very important question, right? And don't forget, I don't even talk about layout and things like that. But specifically, if you think about the form, we need to figure out what is the right timing to ask for anything. I'm always getting so confused and a bit frustrated by all the e-commerce sites, for example, that show up a newsletter pop-up or a push notification prompt or any kind of notification or, I don't know, geolocation requests just when you enter the site. I mean, it's really clear why it's done, right? Because there is a new customer coming in, you don't have any data, you want to have some data in order to be validating input or showing them the right shipping costs in their currency for their country and so on. But we need to think really about what is the right timing, because when you think about something as simple as a newsletter box, right, which would show up on a as a pop-up when you enter the site, it kind of will help, of course, to get some emails for the first-time customers if you offer some sort of like $10 discount or so. But as a business, I just don't really want random emails. I want good emails. I want good emails that people check. I want the good email in kind of list, which has very low bounce rate, have very high opening rates, right? So I care about the correctness of the email. I don't want to just get more emails to pay more money for MailChimp and other services, right? Or Campaign Monitor. I want to get just, good emails. And that means we need to think about when is the right time to show that newsletter box so the customer is actually invested and interested in typing in the correct email address. Because people are not stupid, right? They found a way to trick the system. So if you show the newsletter box which says, please sign up and you get a $10 discount, people know that there are fake email generators and they will use it, especially the younger generation will, right? So by the end of that, you will have a lot of people who will get the discount or maybe multiple ones, right? And you will end up with a lot of really bad email addresses that you can't even use because people who, sending them to don't even exist anymore because all those are fake email addresses. So we need to ask, when is the right time to ask for an email? When is the right time to verify the correctness of the email? When is the right time to ask for password, location permission, push notifications, and to move people into the funnel? When do they need to get enough information? For example, right now I'm working for an insurance company. And with an insurance company, there was a question of when do we drive people to the funnel? What does it mean? Well, there is a configurator where you can choose your own insurance, right? You can choose insurance for your car or for your house and so on. And so there was an idea of let's put those big buttons in the center of the homepage and let's just drive people to configurator so they can actually do that right away. And then there was a conversation, maybe we should do something else instead. Maybe we should drive them to the category first of their choice. If they want to find a car configurator or configurator for their car insurance, right? Maybe let's move them to the car insurance page first, where they can learn about some of the things that they need to know, about some of the extra features that we have and so on, and only then drive people to the funnel. And that was performing much better, right? Than just putting it on the top, because it would cause an incredible bounce rate. And then also, what is the absolute minimum needed to get started, right? So all those things kind of have to be considered. Now let's take it and kind of bring it together into an action. That requires a bit of conversation about input types, because we have different ones, right? And we need to ask ourselves, how do we pick the right ones? So one thing is probably obvious. On the one hand, we have something that's probably the most simple thing of them all, which is an input field. And an input field should be an input field, which means it should be looking like a text box. It's very common to see people struggling with not figuring out even, an input field is actually an input field, because very often they don't have borders and very often they don't have padding, and very often it's really, really hard to read, or decipher or distinguish between them and the background. And so they should look like a text box, and their width gives a clue as to the length of the input it requires. And they also, of course, need a clear label association for accessibility, proper tab order, focus, active styles, and of course, at this point as well, we need to think about the keyboard choice, especially on mobile, autofocus, autofill, autocorrect, capitalization, right? All those things that we probably know for good anyway. But this brings us to one of the patterns that's been very, very famous, and that's become very, very famous with material design, which is, it used to be called the floating label pattern, right? Sometimes these labels will be appearing at the bottom. There is a problem with them. It's not just that they're horrible, so we should never use them, but we need to make sure that they are kind of well understood. And that perfectly, first of all, requires us to think about what is needed to happen for the placeholders, to work here. So when floating labels act as placeholders, they're becoming difficult because they don't leave space for any extra hints. If you have an error message, it'll have to be kind of showing up separately at the bottom. If you need to translate them at some point to another language, it's going to be difficult. They might be cropped on mobile if there is not enough screen. They can be mistaken for a real pre-filled value as well. They might be difficult to read. And so many, many things that need to be considered. We do have one-on smashing. It was a bit of a hassle to make it work. So probably I wouldn't really want to do it again, right? And so the other thing as well is that some screen readers don't announce them, and long hint text might get cut off. So we'll talk about what would be a better way of doing this, but you need to be very, very cautious and get a lot of stuff done to avoid these issues that are showing up with floating labels. Now, on the other hand, we do need to have this conversation, the required or optional or both. Now, there are different studies saying different things, because we could do 4 different things, right? We could, if we have a form, and in the form we have required and optional fields, and usually optionals should not be needed, but they will be needed or required, based on some preferences that business has and marketing has and so on and so forth. So sometimes you have both. So the question is, do we highlight only required? Do we highlight only optional? Do we highlight only none? Right? None of them? Or do we highlight required and optional, both of them? And so there are different studies on that. And ideally, and this is a very good point, I think, we usually in an interface mark something to indicate that it's different, because most of the fields will be required. We probably don't need to highlight them as required. Instead, we can only highlight optional. And that's probably what I would do. But there are also studies like the one coming from Baymard Institute when they tested a lot of e-commerce sites. It's actually better and safer to highlight both optional and required. Also because there are more optional coming up in e-commerce sites than they do in a regular form, like let's say donation form or so, right? And another thing, of course, is that radio buttons need to be round. And I love this example from Gov.uk. Like there's an animation and there's a very clear association with labels and just beautiful, accessible forms, right? And radio buttons are round, right? I probably don't need to say that here, but it is important that they make options easy to compare and scan and select. You can think about things like an airplane fare comparison, right? Where you have maybe a matrix where you have the times and you have the price in the departure date and the arrival date, and you have the price in between, right? And all of them will be radio buttons, right? But they don't have to be only radio buttons. They can also be just big buttons. So this is also a selection, right? In here on Blue Apron, where we have this big box in the middle, right? Vegetarian, signature. They are radio buttons because they're mutually exclusive, so they don't have to look round. But if you make them, in a traditional form, look like a radio button, then they probably should be circular and not rectangular. And sometimes it would be kind of both. So here on the Starlight, you have both a radio button and also the button per se, which also works fairly fine here as well, right? And these are radio buttons, of course, as well, right? But then when we look further, we'll see that this is happening sometimes. And this is, it's not a crime against interface design, of course, but at this point, it's just not very helpful, because if you make a checkbox look like a radio button, just confusing maybe at times. It's really not necessary. On the other hand, if you do have a checkbox, they probably should be squared, right? Again, this is not very surprising, I guess, but this should probably be the case, because this is what people are used to. And in fact, you don't really have to act on only a selection of one. You can also distinguish between groups of checkboxes and then mark them separately, right? Which of course brings us to the one and only select dropdown. And when we look into select dropdown like this, right, I really again argue with the timing argument, right? How much time would I need to fill it in? So if I look at open table, and on open table I have the calendar widget, right, which is fine, right? It's fine. I still think that it could be reasonable to have an input field. But then I have the select dropdowns, one for the time and one for the number of people. And again, at this point, I'm wondering, is there a better way, a faster way to type it in, right? Is there more reasonable to maybe have a switch between PM and AM instead of repeating them all over? Is it better to maybe have two input fields and maybe a little jumper with the arrows to the right, like chevron pointing to the right and to the left, to jump by 1 hour or by 15 minutes or so, right? And then when we look into the number of people, maybe this minus and plus buttons on both edges would be better. It's fine that the default is 2, but do we need 16 people in that select dropdown, right? And the problem with the select dropdowns is that they're just really slow. They're slower than everything else. So if you can avoid them, it's probably a good idea to do so. And this could be done with many different options. Like, for example, whenever you have something that contains only 2 options, like show or hide, you might want to use a toggle for it, right? Whenever you have some sort of minimum maximum range, well, maybe a slider with an option to type in the value right there with an input field, right? Or whenever you have something like the number of bats or baths, right, segmented control, might be a good idea, again, to just have buttons representing that. And the same goes for a series of buttons, like many, many, many buttons, right? Button inputs are great, and they can be quite fast, right? Especially if you have very complex drop-down as an alternative. And in fact, if you look around, you will find that, sometimes when it comes to filters, you will find quite a few interfaces using those button interfaces, right? I think it just has become a thing, mostly because they're much faster to interact with compared to a select dropdown, right? So in general, preferring steppers or buttons like that would usually help more than not help, right? Now, finally, once we have this in place, and I probably need another 10-15 minutes, Martin, please kick me off if you need to wrap up. Hopefully it doesn't have to kick me off. We'll see about that.
I'll let it slide.
Excellent.
Because it's crisp.
Oh, you're being so kind today to me. Now, once we know how people think, and once we know about all these little elements, right, that we have at our disposal, we need to bring it all together. And I want to share with you the strategy that I follow when we do that. And this is kind of related to the notion of input boundaries, which we have to define for our forms. So if we look into a slightly more complex form, like let's say this one, which is a B2B form for a business plan checkout, it has a couple of things. It has a number of users in here on the top, a payment method, payment term, annually, quarterly, monthly, company, full name, email, phone, country, and other things, and disabled submit button. Now, well, what issues could come up in a checkout? Again, when we go back to what I mentioned in the beginning, haven't we solved it yet? I mean, seriously, it's been 25 years in the e-commerce world. We should have done it by now. Well, the problem is we didn't, right? The problem is when I look into checkout, there are so many things that can go wrong and probably will go wrong. Not only complex input like a credit card input, but also things where the input is just required and it's very, very strict and it's really, really difficult to type it in. Layout is confusing, maybe multi-column layout or so. Account that needed to be created to actually fill in the form. Poor performance in terms of feedback from the server, poor support for autofill, poor validation, poor error messages, poor data editing if you need to change it, slow typing, data loss on errors or refresh, aggressive validators. You might have been in this situation before when you type in your address and you're pretty certain that your address is correct, but the validator is too aggressive and it tells you that it's not, right? Do we help, kind of let people proceed, or do we stop them and just abandon them, right? This is again the conversation we need to have. And then disappearing labels, poor IP geo-targeting, especially if you're using VPN, poor support of back button, and lack of auto-formatting, auto-updating, localization, and focus styles. So this is like all these examples are coming from this really great article by, I forgot the author's name, DKO. He kind of looked into a lot of detail. And that really inspired me because I thought, yes, this is probably the way of how we could do this. So if we look into a form like this and we just look at it in a lot of detail, what we tend to do is so-called form profiling. And that means let's take a very close look at every single input field that we've got. And that means we're going to have designers and developers who are responsible sit together and just talk with those things using a checklist that I created. And I love my checklists. And I mean, I'm happy for you to have them as well. And so, for example, when you look into company name, okay, so what do we have here? That would be kind of the way the conversation would go. Okay, it's a required field, so we don't have to fill it, kind of mark it in any way. We want to pre-fill it if applicable. We probably don't want to pre-fill passwords or something like that, right? But we want to pre-fill this. What kind of characters do we support? Do we support Chinese characters? Do we support Cyrillic characters? Do we support entire UTF-8 or 16 or whatever? Yes, we probably do. Any characters are allowed, right? And then maybe we want to do something like adaptive placeholders, which you can do where based on the IP that the user has, you might change the placeholders state, right? It might be an example. It might be something in a local language, which is always dangerous. So we can talk about this as well. And then we need to talk about the minimum length and the maximum length, probably because of the database, right? That sounds reasonable. We can do this. And then we move on to the next one. And that one would be full name. And then here, the same thing, mandatory pre-fill if applicable. We accept alphabetic and space and hyphen and dot. It could be somebody like Mr. or Junior or things like that. Minimum length, hard to say. It's very easy to have somebody who is called all, right? So it could be 2 characters, maybe not 3. Maximum length, do we need to set it? Maybe 70, maybe 150, right? It's just a conversation we need to have. And all of these are not guidelines, right? There's just conversation starters to have with designer and developer think about what is the form going to look like. And then comes the more important or the more difficult part, which, for example, is an email. In an email, you have validation now in place. And you need to think about what the validation is and how do you validate and when do you validate. Is it the inline validation? Do you validate after the field, after the user has left the field, right? Or as they're typing, right? Again, all these conversations need to be had. And then finally, also things like phone number, right? Where you have auto formatting and you have minimum length, which depends on the country, and maximum length, which depends on the country. And you definitely want to have an accessible tooltip or hint where the screener is going to announce whatever the hint is saying. So this thing can to be mentioned as well. Kind of get where we're heading, right? We go just one field at a time, step by step, and we just do profiling on each of them. And then, and this is where I want to kind of just show a little bit more before I kind of close. Here we have the country selector, right? And we know that this is probably not the best way of designing it. So that doesn't mean that an autocomplete would always be better, right? We need to think about what the autocomplete experience is going to be like. So when somebody has started typing United, right, we probably want to highlight at the top things that are more likely to be correct or be useful to the customer, right? So should it be alphabetical order? Maybe not. Maybe we should assign weights to every single item in the list based on our user base, right? And then prioritize the ones where most customers are coming from. But maybe instead of doing just that, right, when somebody has focused on the input field, maybe we want to show them something, right, like a group of frequently used countries and then the alphabetical list of all countries. And of course, the frequently used ones should reappear again in alphabetical list as well, just because some people might be too fast and they might scroll down before realizing that their country, in that case Netherlands, is on the top, right? So we need to have both. And when somebody starts typing, we probably need to readjust that depending on what they are typing, right? Plus, also very important, we do want to make sure that that window over here that covers the text or the form is kind of cut off, so it indicates that it's not complete. Because imagine if you had, let's say, exactly 7 or so frequently used countries that could show up in the list, right? They would be showing up there, but then some people just don't see the scroll bar because it doesn't exist on some of the interfaces, on some of the operating systems, so they will not scroll down and not ever finding that there is an alphabetical list. Now, they might start typing, of course, and we hope that they will do, but you really just want to avoid that. And so that means when it comes to things like that, we need to figure out required, want to prefill if applicable, want to have autocomplete and autocorrect. If somebody is typing in United States but misses an A, right? We probably should correct that instead of saying this country doesn't exist, right? The same thing, we need to support abbreviations like USA or GB, right? DE, NL, CH, and so on. Frequently used countries, alphabetical list of countries, and a fixed height of, let's say, 7.5 cells, right? It can change depending on the viewport that you have. But then we can also think about detection by IP. Do we want to detect by IP and fill it in automatically? If we do that, what's the experience going to be when somebody wants to cancel or edit it when they have a VPN, right? So will we have a cancel link or delete link or clear link somewhere, or will they have to type in to remove all the characters from United States of America backwards? That would be frustrating. Having a cancel link would be much faster, right? So we need to think about these scenarios as well. And then show drop-down on focus, subset abbreviations, validation needed. And then upon selection, we could move to zip code as well. And the most important thing, which is why I think this country selector is the gold mine, really. And I mean, I get why we often ask for the email first, most of the time just because we want to send remarketing emails later. But actually asking for the country early is really, really beneficial, because then based on that, you can change the currency and you can change the shipping costs and you can change all the prices in the shop to the final prices, right? And so because once you know the country, you can change so many things in your form. And this is just an incomplete list of all of them that I could discover. And that's the currency, wording on labels, spelling on buttons, formatting on dates and times, adjusting input masks and text hints, and the wording a zip code or postal code, city country or city state, placeholders, masking, input fields width. I'm very proud of this one. VAT calculation and taxes, and of course also legal requirements. Now you might wonder, legal requirements? Well, you will have to change the behavior of your newsletter checkbox, well, be it opted in or opted out by default, right? Because in some countries, like if you look into Canada, for example, or California or European Union, you will not be allowed to actually mark that newsletter box by default. It would need to be unchecked. But in the other countries, it might be checked. So that's something that would probably have an impact on the behavior as well. Now, with all of that, we probably just need to figure out a few more questions, and then I'm going to wrap up. And the one thing is, when we look into, patterns that are appearing, what is good and what is not so good? Like one of the common ones that has been appearing actually is this way of typing in the values or the country, right, based on the prefill. And the way it works is like, for example, on grace.com, where you're typing your email address and you're typing other things and so on and so forth, right? And eventually you're going to the postal address or your shipping address or delivery address, right? Okay, this is all quite standard here. And so as we continue, what we see here is start typing your street address. I think you might have seen this in the past as well. And the question is it a good pattern or is it a bad pattern? Is it helping or is it hurting? And luckily there is an option to, if you can't find your address, to enter it manually. Now, it's kind of weird because it really heavily depends on the country. Now, you might have seen this in the past, right? When you start typing in your characters, right, of your street, and then eventually you hit a couple of, you tap the pre-selector a couple of times, and then essentially you got your address. Now, that can be very problematic for one reason, and for the reason that actually when you have this thing, You cannot use autofill like at all, right? It's just not going to be recognized. And in fact, if your country, and this is actually quite common in Europe, right? If you start typing your address, you will start with the street address first, which means that you will have to type in the entire street first, and well, street name, and then you will have to type in the number. But if you type in the number first, which is also very common in some other countries, you will actually get the results faster. So normally, you need to know the audience. So if people are likely to type in the street address, it's not really helpful at all. It will be probably way faster with autofill. But if they type in the digit first, right, the house number, then it's probably going to be better, right? On the other hand, the question that often comes up is, do we have a one-column layout or two-column layout for our form, right? And the answer is actually quite simple. Well, if you have two columns, you will always have people missing something, right? Some parts. It could be the left column part or the right column part. It could not be easier ever to just create something very, very simple and very straightforward. I have to show it over here like this, right? It's just always right. You cannot go do anything wrong with it. In my entire history, in the entire time this year when I was doing the usability test, there is never a single issue with the label appearing above the input field with the tooltip or any kind of hint appearing under it, between the label and the input field. This works all the time, like all the time. If you have only one column and it's designed this way, you will minimize the time people need to actually get anywhere, right? And you will also help them avoid mistakes down the line. The only thing, and this is where I'm wrapping up, Martin, the only thing that we need to keep in mind here is that we need to really think about inline validation at this point, because there are three kinds, and all of them are pretty bad. The first one is premature validation, when you just focus on the input field and all of a sudden the interface tells you that you're wrong because you're wrong because you haven't typed in anything yet, but apparently you are wrong already. Well, that's not very helpful. Now we also have immediate validation, which happens as user types, right? And then we also have late validation, which happens when the user has left the field. And fortunately, the late validation has become a standard, although you still find some immediate validation every now and again. But the problem is that they all interrupt users either too early or too late. So there is a way of kind of making it a bit better, and that's the idea behind reward early and punish late. And the idea is quite simple. So for every input, we set a minimum threshold of characters that needs to be passed for the validation to kick in. So we start validating only if that threshold is reached. If there is an error, like for example, somebody typed in the email address with 2 @ we show it immediately without waiting for people leaving the field. So if there is an error for sure, we inform the customer that there is an error, right? And we show success only if the user has moved to the next field, right? So once they left the field where they were and they moved to the next one because the input for that field seemed to be finished. Now, what happens now is when somebody decides to edit a field that was valid, right? It was valid, it was green. Well, we remove the green check the moment they hit the input, right? Again, and they start typing, and we validate when they actually leave it, right? So if there was a mistake, we punish late. Now, if they edit a field that was invalid, right? The moment they hit that input field, we're still showing red, right? But then if they fixed it, right, and they're still in the input field, we show the check mark right away. So we kind of reward early, but then punish late. It's not really groundbreaking, but it kind of helps, right? But this requires a lot of logic. You need to actually make it work for every single input field, right? This is not easy at all, right? Or the alternative would be just to have late validation. And finally, the one thing that we shouldn't avoid or we shouldn't neglect, I guess, is the errors, right? Because the question is, where should errors appear, for example? Should they appear above the input or below the input? Now, they probably need a red border anyway, and it's probably more reasonable to have them above the input field just because both on mobile and on desktop, whenever you're typing, you will see that error. If you happen to be on mobile, this part might be, the error message might be cut off. Right? And there are also other things you can do. For example, if you have a complex form, which requires a lot of steps or so, you might want to change the title every now and again if there is an error, because somebody might have left to another tab already and they don't even remember about that form, so you want to notify them about that, right? Or when somebody hits submit button and there are mistakes, instead of making the button disabled, because it doesn't really communicate what is a problem, we probably want to keep it enabled at all times. And when somebody hits on submit, we can show a little pop-up saying, hey, you need to fix one error, and link directly to that error. Or if there is only one, you can actually say what the error is. Now, that notification could show up above submit button, again, for the same reason that we talked about previously, so nobody will ever miss it, right? And again, just want to really be very specific about this. Whenever we have a disabled submit button, the problem with them is they don't really explain what is wrong. And sometimes users are left wondering what's missing. They're not focusable and hard to read as they're grayed out. With enabled buttons, we can better highlight all the errors. And if you can't do that for some reason, right, and you have to keep disabled buttons, one thing that we tested and it worked like magic, right, is to pick up those people who might be left and who might be not able to proceed by having maybe some sort of a link at the bottom between, under the register button or under the continue button, saying something like, help, I cannot proceed. And when they click on that link, help, I cannot proceed, right? You could just collect all the data that they have submitted already, or they have typed in already, and send it out to the customer support. The customer support has at least a chance to get back to them without just losing that customer for sure. Because if a customer cannot proceed for some reason, maybe because the validator is too strong for the address or so, right, they will be just left out and you will lose their business, right, which you probably don't want to have. Now, all of this just to say, there are many things that we can do with forms, right? And many ways we know what works and what doesn't. And when we look into what people like in 2020, right, this is all quite straightforward. People like fast and accessible experiences. They like large and legible text, large checkboxes and radio buttons, input boxes that look like input boxes, forms that support focus on active states, simple password requirements, predictable tabbing, helpful error messages, good autocomplete, user input that's persistent on refresh. So whenever you hit refresh accidentally or you lose the browser tab, this data still is there, right? Drop down that's opening on tap or click instead of just hover, probably just both, really. Easy undos, edits cancellation, predictable back button, smoothing notification. That's another thing when you have maybe that somebody is going to get a birthday tomorrow and you expect them to get a lot of messages from all the friends or whatever. You could just send them a message saying, hey, we can snooze your notification. Next time you send them a notification so they don't get bombarded with all those notifications for a couple of days at least. Pausing subscriptions, right? It is very common for people that they don't want to cancel, but they just want to pause for a while. So if you have a Financial Times account or so, you just don't want to feel like paying right now. You don't need it, but you don't want to lose all your bookmarks and all. So let people just keep it there and pause the subscription for a while. And also transparent pricing. And these are the things that show up a lot, right? And so if we can mimic and create forms that would actually move more towards this and a little bit less towards the ones that I showed previously, we'll be in a much better space. And maybe we'll make forms fun, like this one, because we can make even the radio button fun. I don't know about you, but I love this one. And why not make people click twice or 3 times or 4 times to actually subscribe to our email newsletter? Maybe that would then we would have a chance to create a really strong emotional connection with them. And they will probably not forget the moment when they actually signed up with that particular service, right? I have way more examples than that, but we probably will leave at that, I guess. So with this in mind, just to wrap up, right? I hope that all these things, all these little examples will help you a little bit to get a better understanding why forms are really difficult, why they're annoying and frustrating, and what we can do as designers and as developers to make forms just a little bit better. I also have a summary, which I'm going to leave here if you want to take a screenshot or so, right, for a while. And with this in mind, just a huge no and thank you for being smashing and being kindful and supportive, and for sticking with all of us throughout this year. And I really hope that I will see all of you next year, the same day in Zurich. And thank you so much, Martin and Alexei, for having me.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for the fantastic presentation. Alexei has just mentioned that you have now the record of the longest Web Zürich presentation. But as I said, it's kind of Christmas, so I'll happily let it slide. And if you want to show the other lovely, delightful animation examples, then I mean, why not? While we are here, if you do you want to?
Yeah, just 2 maybe or 3. And
Yes,
that's it. I
please.
think some of you might have seen them before. But for example, if I look at this one, this is one of the better pop-ups I've seen in my life, actually.
Ooh, my.
I've shown them a couple of times now, but this is just so incredible. And I love how annoying and frustrating it is. But as long as it fits within the story, even a pop-up can be delightful. I think, don't you love this pop-up?
That's amazing. I love it.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, this one, very often you end up with this, like when you're being asked for the date of birth, and luckily at least with the input fields, but then, you can type in 32nd of 43rd month on 1547, and you will still enter the site because they don't really care, right? And you can actually make it more fun, like this, for example, like Austin Beerworks do it. And it doesn't require a lot of effort. So you type in like 21 or not, right? And then it just becomes your choose your own adventure kind of thing. And the interface just, keeps talking to you, and then you just reply to it, and eventually you just don't want to click yes anymore, right?
This is amazing.
Yeah, I wish I could see more websites like this out there.
Oh God. Oh, this is amazing. Sorry, no again. Oh my God. Okay, this is fantastic. This is a beautiful design. I think
the best part is really easy to do. You just need a bit of copywriting there, right?
Yeah. That's a lovely example.
Yeah, and this is the final one I want to leave you with. Because when we're looking into things like checkouts, and we have the title, and this title is very often Mr., Miss, Mrs., and we know why it's being asked and all. But then sometimes you see companies like bodenusa.com, they go a little bit extra mile, I would say. So wouldn't you want to get a package delivered to you as Princess Martin Split?
Yes, definitely. Squadron leader. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And there are so many options in there. It's very cool.
My goodness, that's a lot. Wow.
Yeah,
really nice. I like that.
Exactly. So with this, just hope that all those little things, and I'd be happy to share the slides here as well. And you can go to get the checklist on smash.by/checklists, where you will find everything that I've learned about forms this year. It was a long year, so a lot of stuff about forms that had to be learned.
Was a long year, but also an amazing meetup, I think. I would like to thank our 3 wonderful speakers of today, and also actually all of our speakers for the year, who have taken the time out of their busy and probably somewhat turbulent 2021 activities to actually present in our meetup. And I do hope that next year, at the same time, we'll have you in Zurich again, and we actually get to like chit-chat and have fun like we used to. But until then, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again for being here. And will you be in the live chat thing afterwards?
Yes.
That's awesome. All right. In that case, see you there in a moment.